In today's video, I will sample a guitar loop and show you 6 different ways you can manipulate this loop to use it in your track. So when sampling music, I usually like to chop up samples and do a lot of sound design to a single note or a short sample from often multiple tracks and combine them. Doing all this kind of more advanced sound design is really cool, but sometimes you find a loop and you just want to use a simple loop. Keep the loop sort of intact as a whole and use that in one of your tracks. This is often done in early hip-hop music where the equipment was more simple and people would just loop something and put some drums underneath it. So whether you sample from original music or you take a loop from Splice or one of those platforms, sometimes you still want to manipulate the loop a little bit so it becomes a bit more of your own. So I will walk through 6 different approaches that are very basic, very simple, that you can do in any software and in most samplers as well, and that still gives you something different than the original loop. So for this video I sample a Dutch song listed below, and the song starts with a 4-bar intro. So it's a very basic loop, but it's perfect because there's no drums or vocals on or other instruments on top of this loop. So let's start with approach number 1. Perhaps obvious thing is to reverse this loop. So you go here, reverse, and play it like this. What I would rather do is actually reverse the separate parts. So I'm going to cut it up in 4 pieces and then go into each piece and reverse it. So in that way you still kind of keep the progression of the melody, but it still sounds reversed. And in this way you obscure the original loop, but there's no other trickery going on and no effects, so very basic. The second approach is to reduce the quality. So this is basically inspired by old samplers where you can only sample in 12-bit or 8-bit and it kind of dirties up the sample, but you can also easily do this in Ableton. So let me take another copy of the sample. I will use the utility to make it mono. And then use the redux effect to lower the quality. So I'm going to put the bitrate at 8 and then put the shape on 50. Otherwise there's a lot of noise in the sample. And then for the sample rate, I'm going to reduce it to 3.91 kilohertz. That's very specific because that is the lo-fi mode 2 on the Boss SP202 sampler. So this sounds very metallic-y and lo-fi. The nice thing about using the redux effect and really lowering the bitrate or the sample rate is that you get that metallic ringing tone that's so specific of these kind of low quality, but you can still hear the sample and the melody, so it's not completely obscured. All right, on to approach number 3, that is pitching it up or down. In this case, I'm gonna pitch the sample up because there's already some low end in it, and if you pitch it down a whole octave, so I'm gonna pitch it up an entire octave, so we keep the same notes, the same key. As you can see, the warp mode is on complex. This could work. The only thing is that I first gonna make it mono, and I'm thinking to actually mute some parts of the sample. So I'm just gonna keep the start of each note, and for the rest I'm gonna mute it. So if we have this, we have 8 notes. That's a bit too short, so let's add a delay. And the fun thing about this is that you can still follow the sort of main melody of this sample. So if we compare it to the original, and now the pitch top version with the delay in the muted parts. It is sort of simplified, but it's still the same, sort of in the same world. So far it's all sort of a simple manipulation of the same sample. The next thing I want to do is basically take 2 copies of the same sample and phase them out against each other and then see what we have left over. So this is basically advanced EQing, if you will. So what I'm going to do is add 2 copies on 2 different tracks of the same sample. And as you can see, and also here, is that the left and the right channel are different. So I'm going to use only one channel. I'm thinking to use the right channel. So in the utility, select the right channel. Then make a copy of this one on another track and also use the right channel. So if we now flip the phase on one of the channels, so not the first one, but the second, now it should cancel each other's out because the second one is exactly the opposite of the first one. And it does cancel out the entire track. So if I mute the utility, if I enable the utility, you don't hear anything. But if we just zoom in a lot and move the second one a little bit forward, so it's a tiny bit. So on the timeline, you don't even see it if you zoom out, but if you really zoom in, you can see that it moved a little bit forward. And now we basically cancel out a lot of the frequencies, a lot of the low frequencies. So now you hear kind of only the mid to high frequencies of this guitar sample. And this is great if you want to have some drums underneath and other instrumentation, instead of having a very sort of deep, low sample. Now it's very light. And of course you can play with how much is the offset. So if we increase it a bit more, you hear that the sound, the character of the sound changes. This is too much. Maybe we should do even less. So this is a very simple and easy way to create an interesting character to a sound by cancelling out certain frequencies. It's a bit of a gamble of what is going to happen, but it's also kind of the part where you can have a happy accident and get a really cool sound. All right, on to the 5th way of using this loop. And here we get a bit more specific. So instead of using the entire loop, you can zoom in on one part of the loop and basically create a drone sound, like a sustained sound. So another copy of the same sample. First I'm going to make it mono again. And then I'm going to go into the sample and basically change the warp. So I'm going to click this ×2. So it basically stretches it out twice. And then instead of using what we have now, this first 2 notes over 4 bars, we're gonna change the loop length to half a bar. So the beginning of the note is a bit, you get the attack. So let's use a little bit later part of the first note. And in this way, we have a drone, a sustained sound of this loop. Using audio on the timeline, no sampler, no advanced settings, just stretch it out and use a tiny bit. You can also take the second note. You have this nice little click. We keep that. And one thing you can do is then to have for the second part to say like I take a different part of the same sample. So we move it a bit, let's say here. So the first part is the first note, and then here, let's give it a different color, is the second note, to still create variation. And you could do that for every note in the loop, and in that way sort of recreate the loop. But let's do it now with only 2 notes. So it sounds like this. And with some drums. So you can use this as sort of the intro or a different version. So if you still use the original loop and then use this part maybe for another part of your song. So that's a way to create variation by using the same loop in different ways throughout different parts of your track. All right, and now let's go to the last approach or technique for using a loop in your song. by even manipulating it more, and that's by time stretching it, but in such a way that you actually can hear that it's time stretched. So we're not trying to kind of hide that, but we're gonna try to make it very audible. So let's get into the sample. Let's change the warp mode to texture. Let's pitch this sample up 1 octave, so it sounds like this. And now let's time stretch it. I did that ×2. Let's do it twice. So we have the first 2 notes over a period of 4 bars. Let's do it another time. So now we have the first 2 notes over a period of 8 bars. And now we can play also with the settings of the texture mode. So we can increase the grain size a bit, for instance, and lower the flux. Let's see how this sounds. And what is really nice about this is that you get these artifacts, especially at the end of the note, like this. Now it's very obvious that this is time stretch because also you heard the original, but if you don't know the original, then you might still recognize some of it, but it's also quite different and it's not easy to know where this comes from. And instead of using the entire loop, you only use 2 notes, but you still have a lot of time. It takes 8 bars to get through these 2 notes, and those artifacts that you get with time stretching can be really beautiful. You can of course play around with the different warp modes in Ableton and with the different settings and sort of try to find a sound that you like and that fits with the sample. So the cool thing is about all these different techniques that you still can combine them. So within one song, you can have different parts of the song, different ways of manipulating the same loop. So that's a good way to create a lot of variation with only one sample. So hopefully this was inspiring. Let me know what how you treat loops, if you use loops in your music, what kind of other things you do to them to manipulate them. Of course, you can also combine some of these techniques that I showed you, like time stretching and reverse. You can reverse the time stretched sound and then reduce it in quality to really mangle with it and makes it even obscure it even more. Thanks for watching, keep making music, and see you in the next one.